Advancing religious freedom. My sit-down interview with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo ahead of a historic meeting. Immigration debate. As the midterm elections loom, Democrats propose a bill that would wipe out ICE. An opening at the Vatican. Why an important job steeped in tradition is vacant. And giving thanks. The boys saved from a cave in Thailand gather to pray. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, July 19th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We will have my interview with Secretary of State Pompeo in just a few minutes, but first, President Trump wants another meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, even though he was widely criticized for that last one. The president is pushing back against that criticism and pointing a finger at the media. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. President Trump started his day with a series of tweets touting his meeting with Putin and hoping for another one. He says the summit with Russia was a great success, except for the real enemy of the people, the fake news media. I look forward to our second meeting so that we can start implementing some of the many things discussed, including stopping terrorism, security for Israel, nuclear proliferation, cyber attacks, trade, Ukraine, Middle East peace, North Korea, and more. There are many answers, some easy and some hard to these problems, but they can all be solved. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina is one of many in the president's own party criticizing him.
When it comes to Russia, it's been a bad week, and I think it's imperative that he understand that he's misjudging Putin. We reinforced a narrative that's bad for us as a nation. It came across weak.
Today we also talked with former Indiana Senator Richard Lugar, who met with President Trump in the weeks before the summit. Lugar tells News Nightly he was very embarrassed by Trump's handling of the meeting with Putin and thinks he needs to surround himself with good advisors since he lacks foreign policy experience. President Putin himself says U.S.-Russia relations are, quote, in some ways worse than during the Cold War.
Приветствую всех граждан нашей великой Родины.
Putin says the summit started the path to positive change, but he claims certain people in the U.S. are trying to undermine relations. The White House now says the president disagrees with an offer from Putin to allow the U.S. to question 12 Russians accused of election meddling in exchange for permitting Russia to interview Americans the Kremlin accuses of unspecified crimes. Lauren?
White House correspondent Mark Irons, thank you. Earlier today, I sat down with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to get his perspective on U.S.-Russia relations and America's commitment to religious freedom at home and abroad. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, welcome to News Nightly. Thank you for joining us.
It's wonderful to be with you.
This has been quite a week. President Putin and President Trump gave a press conference that was condemned by the left and the right. Was that press conference criticism warranted?
You know, there's been a lot of heat and very little light following that press conference. I was there. I watched the president's interaction with President Putin after their one-on-one meeting. The president had the objective of taking two countries that had been on a bad path and trying to redirect that. There's no illusion about the challenges that Russia presents to the United States, but in places like counterterrorism, and these are two nuclear-armed nations, if we can reduce the risk from those nuclear weapons, the president was aiming towards creating a channel for communication and dialogue, and he achieved that.
Did you advise him to retract his statements?
You know, I don't talk about the things I give the president advice on, but I'm always very candid about what it is I think we need to do to make sure and keep America safe, and the president has always been gracious in allowing me to say my piece.
Will we see transcripts from either the North Korea meeting or the Russia meeting?
I'd be very surprised if you'd see transcripts from either. That would be ahistorical. There are conversations that I've had with the North Koreans, conversations with the government officials have all across the USG that aren't appropriate for a public release.
Let's move on to religious freedom. You have convened a ministerial to talk about religious freedom all around the world. Let's start with Russia. Russia, especially when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses, is very bad at allowing people to practice their faith. Will religious freedom be on the table when negotiating with Russia?
Well, thanks for mentioning the ministerial that's going to take this place. It's truly historic. It's the first time the State Department has led such a discussion. We'll have over 80 delegations from countries around the world, many religious organizations, NGOs. It should be a great gathering where we will make the point that religious freedom is a human right and that every individual ought to have the right to practice their particular religion, or if they have no faith, to not be punished for that either.
Will there be sanctions if they do not come to the table with religious freedom changes?
With Russia in particular, we have a complex set of relationships. There are many things that are on the table. I think your viewers ought to know that the State Department takes this issue of religious freedom very seriously. In conversations with countries that don't live up to the standards of religious freedom that they ought to have, we raise that issue, sometimes privately if we think that's the most effective way to achieve the change that we're looking for, and sometimes publicly if we think that will accomplish our goal.
When you announced this ministerial, you said that you would bring like-minded countries together. People made a big deal about that. Will Russia be at the table? Will Syria? Will Iran?
There's lots of folks coming. I haven't seen the final RSVP tally, and I'm sure there'll be countries here that we have deep disagreements with. But the mission, when I said like-minded, I meant those countries that are prepared to begin their walk towards the religious freedom that we have enshrined in our Constitution and that our nation so values and cherishes.
American pastor Andrew Brunson is imprisoned in Turkey on false charges of terrorism and espionage. He's awaiting his 4th hearing.
Yeah, we need to get him out. He needs to come home.
You brought the North Korea hostages home. Why can't we bring Brunson home?
We're working it. It's a priority. We're in conversations every day in the State Department with elements of the Turkish government. We remain hopeful and prayerful that Pastor Brunson will be able to return home before too terribly long.
I visited the Nineveh Plains in Iraq. We've seen the destruction in a place where the U.S. declared genocide. I walked into bombed out churches. People have nowhere to live. Total towns are decimated. The U.S. is providing aid to that area, to both Christians and others. How does the U.S. convince governments, not just in the Middle East, to respect religious freedom for all citizens, including Saudi Arabia, where you're not allowed to practice another religion?
The Trump administration has been incredibly strong in promoting religious freedom. It is the case that there are many countries, indeed countries that we often work alongside, who are allies in other places. We work to demonstrate to them that religious tolerance and freedom is good for them. It's good for their country. It's good for their government. It'll bring investors. It'll make their people more productive. We think these are all this fundamental human right, this concept that every individual ought to have the right to practice their own faith. We think makes their countries stronger too, and we work to make that case both by speaking to them about it and in America demonstrating that in the way that we act and operate, in the way that when U.S. government officials are out and about, we respect each of their capacity to worship in the way that they desire.
There are issues of religious freedom here in the U.S. How can you take the moral high ground unless those are addressed?
My faith teaches me that imperfection is all around us. And when it comes to government, that's certainly the case as well. I think the United States stands as an enormous beacon of religious freedom. I'm confident that we can always do better. We ought to do that here as well. But we stand strong here in the United States for religious tolerance and freedom. And I think that's an important demonstration to the world of how valuable that fundamental human right can be to a strong and successful nation.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, thank you for coming on EWTN News Nightly.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
As the nation grapples with immigration, a handful of Democrats are leading a charge to abolish ICE. That's the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. But Republicans are having none of it. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. The House passed a resolution praising ICE agents as brave men and women who enforce immigration laws. It says abolishing ICE would lead to open borders and keep dangerous criminals in the country. The resolution doesn't change the law, but it does send a message to Americans who want ICE gone.
Abolish ICE! Abolish ICE!
Protests in the nation's capital, the city of brotherly love, and Columbus, Ohio. 9 Democrats in the House sponsored a bill to do that, giving Congress a year to come up with, quote, a humane immigration system. Republicans didn't call that bill to the floor, but opted for a non-binding resolution in support of immigration agents.
We should tell our law enforcement agencies we appreciate that they enforce the rule of law in the United States. That's a very important principle. There are many places in the world, a lot of countries in the world where there is no rule of law. A lot of our immigrants actually come to this country to escape situations where law has broken down, especially those people who come here as refugees.
But Democrat Jerry Nadler of New York calls it a distraction.
This non-binding resolution before us would do nothing to bring about a fair and just immigration system. In fact, it would do nothing at all. It is just a meaningless political stunt to change the subject from the international and domestic shame unleashed on us by President Trump.
Nadler and 132 fellow Democrats didn't vote yes or no, but present.
What does a present vote mean?
It means you're not willing to stand up and say I'm for these brave men and women who are protecting America.
Thank you. Immigration could spark a pre-election budget battle. House Republicans released a spending bill providing $5 billion for building President Trump's proposed border wall with Mexico. Democrats have long opposed financing the wall and have the votes to block it here in the Senate. Lauren?
Does that mean we will have another government shutdown?
In April, the president said he had no choice but to force a government shutdown if he doesn't get the border security money that he wants. The new budget year begins October 1st. Without a temporary truce, federal agencies would shut down that day.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. The Organization of American States adopts a resolution condemning human rights abuses by pro-government forces in Nicaragua. The group also criticizes security forces for targeting Catholic bishops. Clergy have suffered 3 recent attacks after they denounced President Daniel Ortega over the killing of demonstrators. One of the country's bishops says on Twitter he applauds the resolution. More than 200 people have been killed since the unrest began in mid-April. Israel's parliament passes a controversial bill defining the country as a nation-state of Jewish people, angering Arab lawmakers. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calls it a historic moment, but critics say the law sidelines Israel's minorities, which make up about 20% of its population. Hungary is facing censure from the European Union's highest court. The EU considers the country too strict on migration. Its prime minister, who was recently re-elected, says the influx of mostly Muslim migrants threatens Europe's Christian values. In May, Hungary donated more than $500,000 to help Christians in Iraq. The Philippines orders a Catholic nun to be deported and blacklisted. Sister Patricia Fox was asked to leave the country earlier this year, but the decision was overturned on appeal. The 71-year-old angered President Duterte by joining anti-government rallies. Her lawyers call the new push persecution. Authorities in Turkey have arrested a controversial Islamic televangelist on charges that include blackmail and the sex abuse of minors. At least 168 of Adnan Akhtar's followers are also under arrest. Akhtar denies the charges and says he's a victim of a plot. Australia's Prime Minister is calling on Pope Francis to fire an Australian archbishop convicted of covering up child sex abuse.
There are many leaders that have called on him to resign. It's clear that he should resign, and I think its time has come now for the ultimate authority in the church to take action and sack him.
Archbishop Philip Wilson of Adelaide is appealing the conviction. The 67-year-old has stepped down as a leader of his diocese, but remains an archbishop. He is the most senior Catholic cleric ever convicted for covering up child sexual abuse. A top position at the Vatican is vacant after the death of Cardinal Jean-Louis Tauran earlier this month. He was Camerlengo, a key role after the Pope's death and ahead of a conclave. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley has more.
Lauren, the Camerlengo, or Chamberlain, is one of only 2 Vatican officials that don't lose their office while the papacy is vacant. The Camerlengo manages church finance and property during the period that's known in Latin as sede vacante, or vacant see. Now, when the Pope passes away, his first task when that happens is to confirm the death. He must also deface the Pope's ring, the ring of the fisherman, to symbolize the end of the deceased Pope's reign. Lauren, he seals off the Pope's study, bedroom, and the entire papal apartment, and he then will help to prepare the Pope's funeral and the conclave that follows. Now, it's clearly a position rich in tradition, and there's no word yet when a new Camerlengo will be named. Now, bear in mind that Pope Francis could also choose not to fill the position, as was the case with Pope Pius XII in 1941. Now, if that's the case, the cardinals would have to elect a Camerlengo themselves in the event of the Pope passing away. At the Vatican, Juliette Lindley, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, U.S. ambassador to the UN criticizes its stand on human rights. Plus, a veteran Washington pundit, Matt Schlapp, weighs in on a busy news week in the nation's capital. U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley is defending the Trump administration's decision to pull out of the United Nations Human Rights Council. She calls it the UN's greatest failure. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reports from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. U.S. officials here at the State Department have long been critical of the UN Human Rights Council. Ambassador Nikki Haley is taking it a step further. She says the council has become a haven for human rights violators, and the United States can no longer support it.
The Human Rights Council has been not a place of conscience, but a place of politics.
U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley sharply criticizing the UN Human Rights Council during a speech in Washington. She says despite its name, it has failed for years to promote basic human rights around the world.
It has taken the idea of human dignity, the idea that's at the center of our national creed, and the birthright of every human being, and it has reduced it to just another instrument of international politics. And that is a great tragedy.
Exactly 1 month ago, Haley and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the U.S. would withdraw from the council. The U.S. is protesting its members, China, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, some of the worst human rights offenders in the world. Kevin Moley, a former UN ambassador in Geneva, who's now with the State Department, applauds the decision.
When the forum designated by the United Nations to promote the cause of human rights becomes so toxic to that very cause, principle demands that we leave.
Moley says the U.S. will remain the biggest supporter of human rights, even though it's no longer part of the council.
And when countries have freedom and democracies don't have famines. Democracies respect human rights. Democracies are what we believe in, and freedoms we are talking about. Religious freedom is an example, the pro-life movement. Those are fundamental to the values we hold.
Now, the head of the Human Rights Council says it is the United States' prerogative to stay or leave if they wish. Behind closed doors, a number of allies say they wish the U.S. would have stayed because it gives the council some level of credibility. Lauren?
Wyatt, Ambassador Haley is a strong defender of the state of Israel. She mentioned Israel in her speech. Tell us about that.
Well, Lauren, Ambassador Haley is defending the administration's longtime position that Israel has the right to exist. She pointed out that Israel is badmouthed over and over again on the agenda, continually on the Human Rights Council regularly. And it's not necessarily because anything Israel has done, but again, simply because of the fact that Israel exists. The U.S. has been a longtime supporter of Israel during UN forums. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. Joining me now, Matt Schlapp in the House, chairman of the American Conservative Union. Matt, welcome back.
Great to be here, Lauren.
What message are we sending by ditching out of the UN?
I think President Trump is all about calling out hypocrisy. Hypocrisy in Europe, hypocrisy with China, hypocrisy obviously with North Korea. When it comes to this commission at the UN, it always seems like the greatest human rights abusers are chairing the Human Rights Commission, and so I think it's a great decision to pull out.
Let's talk about this crazy week that we can call Russia Week, I guess, with President Trump and his press conference with President Putin in Helsinki and the immediate media condemnation of what he has said. Tell us where you stand on all of this. I bet I can guess.
Well, I do think, and I said publicly afterwards, I do think the press conference, the perception was that the president was going soft on Putin, when the president's policies are actually 10 times harder than President Obama ever thought of putting in place. He's kicked out more Russian nationals, spies. He closed a consulate. He's put on all kinds of trade controls. So the Trump policies have been very, very tough on Putin. But rhetorically, he's trying to get along with this nuclear superpower because in the end, he thinks it's more important to get along with Russia and aim our concern at China. That's the big global menace.
Both of these countries have huge human rights issues. I spoke to Secretary of State Pompeo today about what the State Department is doing. Do you believe that human rights issues should be negotiated along with nuclear issues and economic issues?
I believe in the approach that Ronald Reagan had. And the idea was peace through strength, Lauren. And what that really meant was that everyone thought that was just military might, and it wasn't. It was about American values. It was about human rights. We needed to project that onto the global stage. So I definitely agree that basic questions of, like, for instance, religious freedom have to be interwoven in our relationships overseas.
Religious freedom is a topic very new, ministerial, that the State Department is putting together, bringing together all concerned people. It's the first time that something like this has been done. Your thoughts on religious freedom and the State Department and putting this initiative forward?
Well, I want to brag a little bit as a Kansan to have Sam Brownback as the ambassador for religious freedom and to have Mike Pompeo, another great Kansan, as the Secretary of State. I know both of these men. These are men of faith. These are men who are going to aggressively push for the right to practice your faith or not practice your faith and to be safe in your own conscience and how you want to live your life. They view this as very important, and I applaud what the State Department is doing, and I applaud what the President is doing. I don't think there's a higher calling than making sure there's dignity as a human being. You deserve to have the right to life, and then you have the right to live that life as you see fit.
Matt Schlapp, Chairman of the American Conservative Union, thank you for stopping by.
Thanks for being here.
Tonight on EWTN Pro-Life Weekly, the parents of a 4-year-old who was dependent on opioids open up about their decision to adopt her.
We just thought that we would be provided for. Yeah. You know, if Catherine needed something that, you know, later on in life that was tied with, you know, this addiction, that we would handle it.
Catherine captured President Trump's attention at a pro-life gala earlier this year. You can see Catherine Hadrow's interview tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern on EWTN. Up next, Mother Teresa's order responds to controversial allegations. And the boys rescued from a flooded cave in Thailand are back in the spotlight. The head of Mother Teresa's order, the Missionaries of Charity, says her nuns are not involved in the sale of a newborn baby. A religious sister and another worker in eastern India were arrested and charged earlier this month with selling an infant. Sister Mary Prima says while she is deeply saddened by the recent events, they have nothing to do with her order. The Pope will canonize a 19-year-old Italian layman this fall during a synod on youth issues. It will happen along with Paul VI and Archbishop Oscar Romero. Nuncio Sulprizio was a blacksmith who found refuge before the tabernacle where he would keep Jesus company. He died in 1836. The Holy Father announced he'll canonize 2 Italian priests and 2 women who founded religious orders. The ceremony is October 14th. Finally tonight, one day after leaving the hospital, members of a youth soccer team trapped in that Thai cave gathered together to pray. They attended a prayer service at a Buddhist temple near the site of their ordeal. The Buddhist ceremony was held to cleanse the boys of misfortunes. The boys prayed especially for the Navy SEAL diver who died during the rescue attempt. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night and God bless.